My name is Stefan van der Poel and I'm a university assistant professor at the Rijksuniversiteit Groningen. And right now we're sitting in the Groninger synagogue. And looking around we can see that this is a very interesting building with a lot of different influences. One of the things that comes in mind is that it has a very oriental style. And this has to do with the fact that the architect at the time, this is not such an old building, it's built in 1905 and it was opened in 1906. But this architect, who was actually non-Jewish, he was a Protestant, he never had built a synagogue. So his idea was, well, let's make a tour through Germany where there are many synagogues. So he went to Dresden and he went to Berlin. And there he saw synagogues built in an Oriental or Moorish style. And he thought, well, that's an idea for Groningen as well. So he brought this Oriental style, which was very popular in the 19th century in Central Europe. He brought this style to Groningen. But at the same time, he was actually a church builder. And if you look around, you can still see the vertical line and the horizontal line, so it's a cross-like form. So he actually built a church with some Oriental influences, and at the same time he was influenced by the modern way of building at the time by a famous architect called Berlage, who liked to use a lot of bricks. So these three influences are to be seen here in the synagogue. Well, as I mentioned, this synagogue was built in 1905, but the Jewish community itself is much older than that. So at the same spot, there was already a synagogue standing from 1740 onwards, which was much smaller and not that extravagant as this synagogue. Actually, from 1740 onwards, the Jewish community in Groningen grew, and especially in the 19th century, it became quite a large community. So after Amsterdam, The Hague, Rotterdam, Groningen was the fourth in size. So just before the Second World War, there were approximately 3,000 Jews living here in Groningen, close to this synagogue. Most of them were living close here in the area. There was even what we call a Jewish quarter. And the Volkingenstraat was the main road in this Jewish quarter. This does not mean that it was a ghetto. There were never ghetti in the Netherlands, but this was a part of the city where most of the Jews lived side by side. So there were Jewish shops here in the street, and there was a Jewish school in the street, and there was the synagogue. And on Saturdays, many of these shops were closed because of Shabbat, and on Sunday they were open. So half of the population of this area, from the Zuiderdiep to the Schoolholm, Vismarkt, Haddingestraat, that was seen as the Jewish quarter of Groningen. But half of the population was Jewish and the other half was non-Jewish. Well, there were many Jews who came from Germany. So until, I would say, 1850, most Jews spoke Yiddish, which was a kind of mixture of Hebrew, of German, and of Slavic influences. But after 1850, the Jewish community became more and more integrated. So they stopped talking Yiddish and they moved over to Dutch language. And even in this synagogue where we are sitting right now, it was no longer allowed to speak Yiddish because Yiddish was seen as a ghetto language, as something of the past. Now we have become real citizens of the Netherlands, so now we should speak in Dutch. And we should also clothe a bit more like the Dutch people do. And also the whole atmosphere here in the synagogue was quite like one in a Protestant church. So how it was organized, etc. The services were even started with a prayer for the royal family here in the Netherlands. So it was very much integrated. So why did they build this synagogue and took down the old synagogue? Well, actually because of the growth of the Jewish population. So especially in the 19th century, the Jewish population grew. Most of these Jews originally came from Germany because Germany is is close by. It's only 50 kilometers from Groningen to the German border. There were still many family ties between Jews in Groningen and in Ostfriesland, the area in Germany. So, because of the size of the Jewish community, a new building had to be built, and that's why this synagogue was built and was opened in 1906. Not every Jew who was a member of the Jewish community at the time was happy with the result of this building. So there were more conservative, more Orthodox Jews who said, well, this is what you get when you ask a Protestant architect to build a synagogue. He has no clue. He's mixing up all kinds of things, Oriental and church-like elements. And this is not like the old synagogue. Actually, most of the Jews use the word shul, which originates from the German Schule. So a synagogue is not a church. It's a place where you come together. That's also the origin of this Greek word synagogue, place where you gather. And why are you gathered there? To learn. So it's more like a school. It's more a place of gathering to learn from the Holy Scriptures. Well, as you can see, there is now a division within this synagogue. So there is a fence, more or less halfway the synagogue, and after this fence, there is still a synagogue where services are held every 2 weeks. People gather. But before the fence, this is more a cultural space where exhibitions or readings or concerts take place, and that's open for everyone who wants to visit the synagogue. Why is this synagogue divided? This, of course, has to do with the Shoah, with the Second World War. So before the Second World War, there were more or less 3,000 Jews. After the Second World War, only 200 Jews remained. Not all of these Jews were actually religious Jews. So there is still a Jewish group here in Groningen, but it's only a small minority that is actually active within the Jewish community. I would say that nowadays there are about 50 Jews still active within the Jewish community. To have a service, you need a minyan, and that means 10 Jewish men. And that's not always possible. So sometimes they even have to telephone a man to come over, because otherwise we're only with 9 of us and we need 10 men to start the service. Otherwise we cannot start. So it's a very, very small community, and of course the future is very insecure. Most of the people are rather old, and there are not too many young Jewish people here in Groningen, only now and then some students, but they leave as well after a few years. So the future is very insecure. As I said, the origin of the Jewish community here in Groningen is not Sephardic, so it's not from Spain and Portugal. You had Sephardic communities in the Netherlands as well, especially in Amsterdam and The Hague and Middelburg, the capital of the province of Zeeland. But most Jews in the Netherlands were from Ashkenaz backgrounds, so did not speak Ladino, the language, the Sephardim, but they spoke Yiddish, and the customs and the services within Ashkenaz community are quite different from the Sephardic community. After the war, this synagogue was actually more or less empty, and the small Jewish community that remained had another smaller building here in the neighborhood where they had their services. And actually this building was on the list to be destroyed. So it had no use for anyone anymore. The city government of Groningen had an idea to build an apartment block on this spot because it's well situated in the center of Groningen. But only because some of the people here in Groningen thought, well, there are hardly any Jews left, and this is a kind of heritage which is still there, and it's a very tragic history of the Jews in Groningen. It would be very sad to see this building leave as well. So it became active, found all kinds of sponsors, and in the end they were able to keep the building and to renovate the building, and now it has this public atmosphere or this public space with the exhibitions, etc. And part of this building is used by the small, very small Jewish community, which is actually renting it from the organization that is owning the synagogue. I would say that the Jewish community was rather integrated within Dutch society. So they took part in daily life with non-Jews that were living close to them. So they spoke the same language. Most Jews were still marrying within Jewish circles, but there were already some Jews, especially after 1900, that married non-Jews. That actually meant that Jewish identity was given up, because you can only be a Jew when your mother is a Jew. If your family is partly non-Jewish and partly Jewish, well, most people are no longer a member of the Jewish community. There were also some Jews who became Protestant, and a few even Catholic. Well, then you also take steps to end your Jewish identity. You become even more a part of the Dutch society. But actually, I would not say that there was real anti-Semitism here in Groningen. When Groningen was occupied by the German forces from 1940 onwards until 1945, the Jews were deported, but there were even many people protesting against the deportation of Jews from Groningen. So the Jews were brought to the train station, and from there on they were brought to all kinds of camps, first here in the Netherlands and then further to the east, to Poland. Often there were groups of people, non-Jews, who came to the train station to protest against this deportation of Jews from Groningen. So it shows already the size of the integration of Jews within Dutch society. There were also in Groningen, of course, many people who collaborated with the Germans, and there were also many Groningers who had some sympathy for fascism, but often it was the case that they understood fascism, National Socialism of the Germans, so these more right-wing people, but they did not understand the part of anti-Semitism. They could not see why this was such a threat to Dutch or European culture. Because most of the Jews here in Groningen, but also in Netherlands and in general, were rather poor. So this stereotype idea of the rich Jew, it doesn't come up for the Dutch Jews. Most of them were rather poor. That also explains why Jews were actually concentrated in this neighborhood, because this was seen as a rather poor neighborhood with very small houses. So if you didn't have enough money, you might end up here in the Volkingenstraat or close by to the Volkingenstraat. So that explains why Jews were concentrated in this part of the city. It was seen not as a very good part of Groningen town. What is interesting actually about Groningen, so the name of the province is also Groningen, that there were also small Jewish communities within the province of Groningen. So close by to the city of Groningen, there were all kinds of small villages, and even there were small Jewish communities who were active, had their synagogue, etc. It was not only concentrated here in the city, but also in the province of Groningen. So if you would go in southern direction, you will pass by a park which is called Sterrenbos. And in front of this Sterrenbos, at the Herenweg, you will find hands that are a few meters high. And actually these are 7 hands, and that's not by coincidence. This reminds us of the menorah, which is a candle of 7 arms. And these hands stand for the Jews that perished during the Second World War. Not only the Jews from the city of Groningen, but for the whole province of Groningen. So that reminds us of the Jewish life, but also and especially here in the street of the Volkingenstraat. So after the Groningen Museum was built, suddenly the Volkingenstraat was used as a very fast way from the train station to the center of the city. And suddenly far more people passed through this Volkingenstraat. And then the city of Groningen thought, well, then we have to renew the street a little bit. And so nice tiles were put on the pavement. And they asked 7 or 8 artists to come up with pieces of art that are shown here in the Volkingenstraat that remind us of the life that was once here in the Volkingenstraat.